Good morning, afternoon, and night to everyone joining us. We have Chen Yu Lin joining from Taiwan, where I think it's around midnight. So thank you. You're a hero for being here. We're going to be having a conversation today about the nitty-gritty behind the scenes of literature and translation. How does a book in another language enter the Anglophone marketplace? What considerations must agents, editors, and funders keep in mind? Joining us today to shed light on these questions are agent Safae El-Ouahabi, publisher Marigold Atkey, and Chen Yu Lin from the Taiwan Ministry of Culture, whose insight on how the literary sausage is made will, I'm sure, be invaluable. There is a lot to get through, so I'm going to dive right in. But first, a few words of thanks to the British Centre for Literature and for Literary Translation for hosting this event, and to the University of East Anglia, National Centre for Writing, Arts Council England, National Museum of Taiwan Literature, and Ministry of Culture, Taiwan, for their support. We're going to basically have a short introduction followed by some questions for each of the panelists, and in the last 15 minutes, the audience will be able to ask questions. I understand I'm technologically inept, but I understand that there is a Q&A thing at the bottom where you can input your questions. And if you have any questions about how to do that, Anna Good is in the chat and will be able to help you. Now to introduce our panelists before the KGB style interrogation begins. Since joining RCW in 2019, Safae El-Ouahabi has worked with Claire Wilson and John Wood and is building her own list. She has a strong interest in dynamic, voice-driven narratives with a sense of urgency, stories that are emotionally impactful and have a strong hook without being overridden. Safae is dedicated to championing the work of translators and authors alike, and to fight for their space on the best-selling shelves. She welcomes submissions in the adult, YA, and crossover spaces, representing a wide range of books, including speculative fiction, YA romantasy, historical fiction, and adult rom-coms. Her clients include Anton Hoare, Andy Darcy Theo, Chloe Ford, Shana Tan, who is also a previous mentee of mine, Claire Richards, and Sandy Juson Lee, among others. Marigold Atkey is publisher at Daunt Books. Among the books she has published, there are Catherine Scanlon's Kick the Latch, Rita Bullwinkle's Headshot, and Dina Brooks' Lord Jim at Home. Daunt is also the home of English language translations of the works of, among others, Natalia Ginsburg, Scholastic Mukasonga, Montserrat Roig, Elisa Chua du Sapin, and Nona Fernandez. And last but not least, especially considering that Chen Yu Lin is the most in the future and therefore probably has the most magic in this room, Chen Yu Lin joined the Department of Humanities and Publications at the Ministry of Culture of Taiwan as section chief in 2016, since when he has been responsible for helping publishing industry and publications of Taiwan to expand into international markets through major book fairs and the grant for the publication of Taiwanese works in translation. I figure I should probably introduce myself. I was about to just, steamroll forward, but it's presumptuous. It would be presumptuous of me to assume you know who I am. I'm Julia Sanches, and I am a literary translator working from Portuguese, Spanish, and Catalan, and I also am the very part-time rights director of Tilted Axis Press, which is a UK-based publisher of literature and translation. So I wanted to start with a question for all of you, and you can either jump in and answer, or I could be like a second grade teacher and call on one person. So as a sort of global question, can you each talk a little about how your professions intersect with literature and translation and how each of you got where you are today? I'll give you 2 seconds and then I'll call names.
I can go. I can go. So hi, my name is Safa. Thank you so much, Julia, for the introduction. I work at RCW and I'm building a list of translators alongside my author list at RCW, but with a particular focus on literature from Asian and African countries. And it all started with my first client, Anton Her, who came to us for his original fiction work, but he also wanted us to start taking on his translation projects because he has so many projects on the go, and he found that it was negotiating everything, advances, royalties, contracts. It was taking up a lot of time and energy, and leaving very little time for him to actually work on his craft, the actual translating part of his job. And so I started taking on translation agreements and contracts and focusing on the nitty-gritty aspects of that side of things. And it was going really well. And Anton basically started introducing me to his friends, his colleagues, and saying, hey, this is why it's useful having an agent and what can come of that. And it's been very successful so far. And as Julia mentioned, I've signed quite a few translators as a result. With Anton, most of the time, publishers reach out to us with projects. So it's mostly about negotiating from the start. But with my other translators that I've taken on, they've brought projects to me for pitching. So they will find something that they like and they'll say, hey, like I really want to translate this and work with you on it. We contact the rights holder and we go out with it in the UK and the US and try to find a home for it. For example, Shanna Tan, who Julia also had mentored, recently brought to me, and she introduced me a Taiwanese author called Giddens Co. And we're very close to finding a home for his work in the English language market for the first time over here. It should be a very exciting author translator duo to come, and I can't wait to share more about it when I can. But that's the kind of summary of what I do in terms of agenting and working with translators.
Thank you so much, Safa. I'm going to choose Marigold Atkey next.
Thank you, Julia. Hello, I'm Marigold. I'm from Daunt, and what Julia didn't mention is that we worked together on a book, The Time of Cherries, a Catalan book by Montserrat, and I'm going to mispronounce her surname, Rog? I never quite nailed it. Rog. And I first worked on translation at Bloomsbury, and that was really interesting because I worked on both crime and translation, so quite commercial stuff, but also at the literary end of fiction, so a French author. And also for me, one of the most interesting books to work on actually in my career was Sanmao's Stories of the Sahara, which is this kind of strange auto-fiction collection of, it's supposedly non-fiction, but it's definitely fiction because it has ghosts in it. But that was interesting because she is dead, so you had to deal with that. And I was working with a brilliant but debut translator, and the text, Sanma was such a fascinating character, but her language was of its time, so you had to kind of navigate that, how you retain the truth of what the translation was and of its time, but also it was really interesting, and is something that I think about both in English language originals and in texts such as The Time of Cherries that we worked on as well. And then at Daunt, the joy of being at Daunt is that it's quite a literary house, so they're not scared of smaller sales figures, quite honestly. Then, we're not going for the massive Sunday Times bestsellers, although obviously books like Butter have, of course, been huge bestsellers this year. But because it began as a travel bookshop, our list is international. So that's a real joy to be somewhere where it's really important to us to try and look beyond our own shores.
Thank you. Lynn, would you like to speak a bit?
Okay, I'm Yu Lin. I'm from, as Julia has introduced, I'm from the Taiwan's Ministry of Culture. And since 2016, I've been responsible for helping Taiwan publishers to expand into international markets, which includes GPT program, the grant for the publications of Taiwanese works in translation. And that was the moment my career crossed paths with literature in translation. And I would like to take this opportunity to share with you, to make a quick introduction to you the GPT program. I think it may help your translation work in the future. And okay, it's GPT is a program set up by my Ministry of Culture in Taiwan, and we want to encourage the publication of Taiwanese works in translation overseas. And we accept applications twice a year, every April and every October. And beginning from 2015 to 2024, a total of 371 projects has been awarded, and include 36 different languages. Japanese being the dominant language, about 1/3 of the entire cases, and followed by French, about 16%, and English, 15%. And all of these works, famous works like Wu Mingyi's The Man with the Compounded Eyes, and also The Stolen Bicycle, which was long-listed for the Man Booker International Prize, and also Kevin Chen's Ghost Town, and also the latest one, Taiwan Travelogue, made history Wednesday as the first Taiwanese novel to win the U.S. National Book Award for translated literature, which is a really good news for us. And the GPT program is open for foreign publishing houses. So if you are a translator, you can work with the publishers, urge them to apply for GPT. In fact, this is very common in our program. And the grant, the maximum grant available for each project is 600,000 New Taiwan dollars, which equals 15,000 pounds maximum, but also which includes 20% of tax. And the grant covers 4 kinds of fees: licensing, translation, marketing, and also the book production fees. And I hope this information will be useful for you. And if you have any further question, you can search online the GPT, and we have an email for everyone to for your any questions. Okay. So thank you for your listening.
Thank you so much, Julian. My eyes were just like growing because as I was explaining and before we went live, most of the languages I translate from do not have funding, except for Catalan, which I believe that, sort of explains why there is so much Catalan literature translated. So while we're on the topic of funding, I think this could be it could be helpful to hear from both Marigold and Safae about how funding, one, affects your decision to acquire a book, like where it falls on the scale of like all of the considerations that you have. And for Safae, I guess, in terms of how, when you're pitching Shana Tan's project to US and UK publishers, like where is funding sort of placed front and center of the pitch as a sort of hook for publishers? I don't know if you want to go first, Marigold.
Sure. Yeah, funding is extremely important to us, unfortunately, because when you have the double cost of translation and so with the book, you obviously have the 2 sets of rights. You have the underlying and the translation. And so the allure of a grant is a massive bonus, particularly if you're buying a book. So for example, we're publishing a book in January by a Belgian author that's translated from the Dutch, which is a kind of a beautiful novella. But if you kind of think of the Penn criteria of, I would say diversity is where I would worry about it, because essentially it's very easy to pitch it as Edouard Louis meets Garth Greenwell. And I love that kind of book, but there are lots of them. So it's not necessarily startlingly new in what it's doing. It's beautiful and it's moving, but I would worry about that. But instead you've got the Flemish body who are saying, we can grant you money both for the translation fee and for publicity costs. So that is a real plus for me. I will, I'll also look at shorter books because translation is paid per word. So that can help, quite honestly. So if there isn't a grant available, because obviously there often isn't, then I would be thinking of the PEN criteria of literary quality, which I would be thinking of for artists anyway, and the strength of the project. So I would want to see kind of good reviews, that kind of thing. But also I would be thinking about what new thing is it bringing to our landscape.
Do you have a sense of how many of the books you publish in translation receive funding? Like, are there any books that you published that
I
received funding at all?
think oddly Mukasonga, who's French Rwandan, we always buy her from Archipelago, who are the brilliant US house, and Gallimard. And she's received PEN funding, but never funding from a French body, which I find very surprising. But because we buy from the US, they handle that side of things. But otherwise, we've received funding, I think, for all of our books, maybe not for Nona Fernandez. But otherwise, yeah, funding for all.
Thank you. What about you, Safae? When you're pitching a project, how does funding factor into how you frame the work?
I think pitching that stage is probably where funding is less relevant to our jobs. Funding for us is helpful once you've secured a deal and you say to a publisher, look, this project has this money behind it. You can apply to these grant organizations. This is how the funding works here. And you explain and break down where they can get this money from, because translation projects are so tightly costed. And so that helps in terms of the negotiation aspect of it. For us, I think where funding becomes most relevant is the sample stage, because obviously we don't have entire manuscripts available to us at the beginning like we would with an English language author. You would just have the full book and you would send that out to publishers. And so we need to find a way to pay translators for their work, their sample work, because we can't guarantee that we can sell the books. And so you need to make that worth their time and compensate them for that labor. And so funding, for example, in Korea, LTI Korea provides funding for samples, and there are other grant organizations that do similar things, which makes it easier for us to take on projects if we know that this translator can be paid for their sample work on this book that we're really interested in. And it essentially allows us to take on more projects. And if there isn't funding for samples, we run up against the wall, because while you might be really interested in something and really want to move forward with it, if there isn't this budget, if there isn't a budget for paying for samples, then you're kind of you've hit a wall, because you can't pitch a book without a sample, and you can't sell those rights and then get that translator paid for the full manuscript. And so it can create issues, I think, for us from an agency perspective at the much earlier stage, and that's where funding is so crucial to us.
Thank you. I'd actually be curious to hear more about how, if there's any sort of like tangible difference between pitching and, you know, you mentioned in English you have a full manuscript, so you're I mean, I suppose unless it's like a nonfiction proposal, but you know, you have different materials for English than you do in translation. Are there any other ways in which you have to frame the work differently to get the publisher's attention? Do you find that there are specific publishers that you're submitting to over and over and over again, perhaps like Marigold, because like we know the people who are friendly and open to translation? Yeah, can you get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty?
The pitching is definitely different. What remains the same as an original English language work is that you're trying to convince a publisher why this is commercial, why you should take it on, why you should be excited about it as well. That remains the same, and so we have to craft a very pitchy, like a very punchy pitch letter to really pull them in. But the pitch letter is very different to the pitch letter I would do for an English language author, because what I have to do is say to them, okay, this is what's happened in Korea and Taiwan. This is the author's profile. This is what's happened with that book. This is how it's been received domestically, or this is how it's done in other territories. I have to make them, give them reasons for their salespeople to be compelled by the project and to really put themselves behind it. And that is not something that I have to do with English language authors, because I have a full manuscript and they can just read the full thing and go, okay, we can see where this is going. And but when you have only 30 pages, I mean, that's the maximum you really get. You run up against, you can't basically allow the editor to kind of just fall in love with the story, right? Because they don't have the rest of the story, and they can't tell the sales team, well, this is the same, like they can't argue it, make a case for it in the same way that they do for an English language author. And so they do focus quite a lot on sales, but it's not the case that sales is the deal breaker. Like, if they're obviously, like, a lot of the best-selling authors will be taken, and translators should always go after like what they're interested in, but the key here is to like find something that is like, perhaps the author has like a certain like brand, like reputation, or kind of a brand or an image. It's something that will help the agent kind of craft it in that way, and say, well, this is the author's profile, this is the profile of the book, this is where it fits in the current market, how it works in with these trends, and then it kind of helps us construct an argument from there. But it is much more difficult and much more intricate, I think, than just doing the standalone English language author.
I'll take you out of the hot seat in a moment, but follow-up question is, how much information are you getting from the translator to build this profile, and how much of your own sleuthing are you doing?
A lot of it, yeah. So a lot of it is contacting the rights holder and basically saying to the rights holder, give us as much information as you can about reviews, anything, like tell us what we need to know. And then the translator, what they do for me is they'll like write, so they'll obviously do a sample, but then they'll do a book report, right? And they'll say, this is why, this is what the themes are, and this is why you should be interested, this is what happens like throughout. And you really pull someone in, and it's kind of like a love letter to the book, and you're showing an editor like why they should be invested, and why, even though they don't have the full material now, they will be if they put money behind this project and publish the book in full. And so it's teamwork. Working with translators is so crucial. I could get absolutely nowhere if I wasn't working with translators, if I hadn't signed anyone, because it's the one way to get access to these projects. And especially because I'm working in the Asian and African languages, which are quite underserved in the English language market, I need to be able to find people who are very plugged into that world, and really know like what's out, why it's doing well, why people in the English language market would also be drawn to it. So that's why it's kind of like very important for translators to stay connected to market trends, and focusing on translating books that are in genres that are doing well in the English language market, right? Because then it makes it easier to sell than like short stories or poetry or books with experimental format that are traditionally a bit more niche and harder to sell in the English language market. And you will generally run into a lot more issues with those. So kind of being as plugged in as possible basically will massively help a translator land work, I think.
I love hearing that, and also in my body I'm like, oh no, but that's just so much work. I just want to sit and hang out and translate books. Marigold, sort of taking what Safae has said, what like the narrative that she builds around the author and like the sort of the sales landscape in other territories, how much do you consider this? What are your priorities when you're receiving a work in translation? I don't know if you want to talk about the Montserrat Roig situation, because I feel that was unique in that your publicist reads Spanish and so was able to access the full book.
Yeah, kind of, to be honest, often when I first look at a submission, I do look at which other houses have bought it, because I will know particular lists that I admire, who I feel share a sensibility with ours. But then I was just thinking of the books that I've bought, and actually, like, one of them has sold to a couple of other languages. I'm sure Nona Fernandez has sold to many others. And and we have a French book next year that I don't think is sold anywhere else. So it's something I look at submissions. But actually, when it comes down to it, I think for me, what I find really important is the sample, first of all. And then also I do basically do a horrible Google Translate of a load of reviews. So sometimes translators will have done that for me, which is very helpful, but otherwise I'll just kind of trundle off and see not only what papers are saying, but also what just normal readers are saying. Because I think you can work out from most reviews if the reader is kind of enjoys the same kind of book as you.
Are you going on Goodreads?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I feel that you kind of take all of that into consideration. But also as well, I would say massive for me is the translator. We have worked with debut translators before. So it might just be that they write really beautifully, but also I might already trust their taste and think of the translator. So in the case of you, and in the case of Michelle Hutchison and Jordan Stump, like Jordan is somebody who I find his taste fascinating. I would read anything he's translated. So with the French book, what happened there was actually the TLS reviewed the French original, and then so our assistant editor and I both clocked it and thought it sounded interesting. And then by coincidence, the very next day, Jordan emailed me to say, "I think this will be really up your street. Here's my sample translation. Here's all the reviews." And so that just was really the stars aligning, I think. But there, Jordan's involvement was really key because I trust his taste. I think he does really interesting work.
So it sounds like there is also a mutual understanding of taste. Sort of Jordan reached out to you because he knows what kinds of books you publish, and you would trust Jordan's judgment because of his translation track record. I guess how helpful is it to you to see in a pitch that the person pitching has a sense of who you, Marigold, are insofar as your taste in books, what you've published at Daunt? Like, is it equally important to know the market trends in?
Yeah, I think it is. I think
Brazil
although I can really roll my eyes at kind of comp titles, there are a few titles that comped again and again. It's so weird. Night Bitch is comped the whole time. I'm like, I'm not interested in Night Bitch. But anyway, I think it's interesting. I think it is useful when agents or translators do say it's like this author or like this book, because it will either flag. It doesn't matter to me if it's from our list or not. I'm more interested in how they see the book, where they see it sitting on the shelves in the real world, and that will tell me whether it's something that I'm going to be interested in.
So that's another follow-up question, a little bit about Daunt being this unique publisher that also has a bookstore. And I feel like when we were working together, if I'm not misremembering, you ask the booksellers for their opinions on like the cover. Is that it? Or can you tell me a little bit about how the bookselling aspect plays into decisions you make about like the product of the book or even the acquisition of the book?
It's right from the beginning of the acquisition. So we have 3 booksellers at our flagship store of Marylebone. If anybody doesn't know, Daunt Books has about 8 shops, I think maybe more. Most of them in London, a couple are out. And it began as a travel bookshop, and they're now just generally nice bookshops. And we have 3 booksellers at Marylebone who have sign-off on all our acquisitions and covers. And I go to them with kind of tedious other stuff as well, but those are the things where they do have sway. And so they will stop me from, I tend, both with covers and acquisitions, I tend to either go too quiet and beautiful or too weird and ugly, and they will pull me back from those. And annoyingly, they do tend to be right. Sometimes I've dug my heels in once recently. But they're, unlike other houses where I've found it really frustrating when there's perhaps somebody in power who I think hasn't worked anywhere else for decades and maybe has quite stale taste, both in literature and in covers, because they've just been reading the same in-house stuff for years. These booksellers are seeing what works every single day they're in the bookshop, and they're seeing what works as covers, they're seeing what works as books. So that's invaluable. And then the really important thing for us, what makes a massive difference to us being able to buy literature and translation, and also think of kind of having a really international feel to our list, is the fact that we get to give the booksellers proofs of the books, and they also get to have finished copies of the books. We email them, not as a kind of public email, but we email all the booksellers. Just when a finished book comes in, we'll email them like a love letter about it. And then we don't have any say in window displays or table displays, but quite often we do have window displays and table displays. And then I see the stock in all the shops every single week. So we'll know where's falling low. So ideally, our books are never out of stock, and they will always have a few copies in stock. And Ginsberg, for example, she will have a window display for like often, a whole month or something, which would be really unheard of if we weren't Daunt. So I imagine it's galling for other small independents, but basically it's invaluable for us. And like, what an incredibly canny business move of James Daunt to set up a publishing house, because it just helps our sales figures. It's really good. And you have booksellers who love the books, and who, a lot of them are kind of career booksellers. So once you've got them in love with the book, they're going to be selling that book for years to come. So that's a real joy.
And how do you get them in love with the book?
I buy great books.
Safae is trying to get publishers in love with the book. You're trying to get booksellers in love with the book. You're trying to get readers in love with the book.
I've got to know certain individual booksellers. So, we're having our Christmas party with them. They can come to our showcase, which we have once a year, and we also email them about the books. So it's really, booksellers love reading, and if they're getting free proofs and free books, then it's a case of kind of crossing our fingers and hoping they fall for it. And now and again we get to go to Marylebone and see them, or have an event over at Holland Park or over the Hampstead one.
Thank you. I'm going to switch tracks to funding again. I'm very curious how if everything gets funded, how you decide what gets funded, if you've been able to track an increase in Taiwanese literature and translation due to funding. I don't know when exactly the program started, and like how much of an impact it's had on the availability of Taiwanese literature and translation for you, Lin.
Okay. Earlier, since the program started, yes, we see rises in the publication of Taiwanese works. Now we grant about 80 foreign publishers each year. In previous years, there were only about 30 to 40 in 1 year. So this is quite a rise, and we wish the number will keep growing, going up. And about the selection criteria, we have, I think, because the application number is still limited. So actually, we will encourage as much as possible the books foreign publishers want to translate it from Taiwan. So for us, if it's a good books, well, we will grant it. Yeah, we will just want to help as much as possible Taiwanese works to translate it overseas. Yeah. And yeah.
Sorry.
Did I miss anything?
No, my follow-up question is if you also have a program for funding samples. So like a short excerpt of the book, which would be very useful to both Safae and Mary.
Okay. We do have another program called Books from Taiwan. And in their website, we have sample translations of many Taiwanese books, and which was completed by our ministry. So so the foreign publishers or translator like Safae or Marigold doesn't have to translate by their at their own expense. They can use the samples we provide. So I think it will be helpful for you to for anyone who is interested in Taiwanese books.
You mentioned earlier Taiwan Travelogue by Yuang Zhengzi, and the fact that it's just won the National Book Award in Translated Literature on Wednesday. In fact, just four days ago. I can't count, but it was very recent. What effect do you feel that will have on your work? Do prizes increase interest in a national literature? In your experience, can you imagine this book? I'm actually not sure if this book has been translated into many other languages. Do you think that would help get the book to, I don't know, Brazil or Peru or France?
I think a price helps really, and Taiwan Travelogue was already published in Japan. I think it was last year, and it has won a translation award in Japan also, and which it has it's sold quite well there. So it has also quite well, and I think the prize will help this book to attract more interest from other European countries. So I think it helps, and in the long term, I think more prizes will help more Taiwanese books to sell to foreign publishers, and we hope that we will keep working on that. Yes.
Thank you. For Marigold and Safa, how do prizes affect your work? I know that there's the danger of putting too much hope in like the International Booker to boost your sales, because it, at least for Tilted Axis Press, it can change our year. But are there any other ways in which you consider perhaps Marigold like prizes in other countries? Does that play into your thinking at all?
Yeah, very much. So we've bought a couple of Japanese novellas for 2026, and both of those had won quite prestigious prizes in Japan. So I looked at the kind of previous winners of that, because sometimes a prize can mean nothing to me, and then I'll look up to see who else has won it, and I'll get a feel for what kind of book wins it. And this is one where I thought it's clearly a really good one to win, and that plus sales. And definitely, obviously, the kind of Prix Goncourt, that kind of thing, would be a big sign to me.
Someone was explaining to me that Prix Goncourt, the author gets like €1.
Yeah.
But they're just assured that the book will sell in so many territories that the fact that they're only getting €1 as a price money doesn't really matter.
Quite French. I like that. So yeah, other prizes definitely. Prizes in other languages definitely will help.
What about you, Safa?
I think it helps for the reason that Marigold just outlined. It helps in the pitch letter if we can outline any kind of prizes or prestigious awards that the author has won abroad, then that helps us kind of highlight that to publishers and to show them like why you should pay attention. How will this help them in their like acquisitions meetings and discussion with their salespeople? So for the same reasons, again, it's massively helpful to incorporate anything in the pitch letter wherever you have information. It's really useful.
So here's a follow-up. What about translators who've won prizes? Like, does that change anything at all if you find that, you know, you want to start working with a translator and they've, I don't know, won the International Booker or the National Book Award? Does that play into it? Because awarding translated literature is a little bit odd, because you can have this book that is beautifully translated, but the book is not, you know, as compelling as another one. So there are so many factors. So yeah, I'm just wondering if that plays into your thinking at
And
all.
well, I mean, if we're talking about like representing a translator, for me, it doesn't really matter how many prizes they have. I'm more looking at their writing quality. The biggest thing I look out for when I'm reading samples is, can this person capture voice? Like, is this sample different to the next one because they're completely different authors, so the voice should be different? And I've gotten samples before where the voice is just exactly the same in each, and it's like completely different authors, genres, but it just feels very robotic, right? And that's kind of what an AI does. It just spits out this kind of robotic emotion, this kind of piece of writing, and it doesn't capture that voice, and that's why translators are so important. So whoever, if people have that craft, that's what matters first, and then it just goes from there. Really, it's just about finding the right project that fits, you know, the right genre, the right the if those things kind of align, that's what matters to me. So I'm not necessarily looking at, has this person like been shortlisted for the international booker or whatever. It's more about their writing quality, because the awards will follow from there, like, and that's kind of, as an agent, like, it's our job to take people from the beginning and like move them up from there, and not kind of just like take a fully ready product and be like, it's done now, I don't need to do anything. And so yeah.
Thank you. I have so many questions to ask about translators being represented by agents, because I don't know, I've been doing this for about 10 years now, and I've always been convinced that translators are too underpaid to give agents a cut, and too underpaid for agents to like get any benefit from taking a cut from our like tiny pool of money. So, but you have started representing quite a few we talk about you a lot, Safa. Like, how do we make this happen? How does this work? And I guess I'm curious. So you'll have, like, you know, Shana Tan is bringing, I'm going to keep using her as an example because you mentioned her, but like this Taiwanese project. But you're representing her while pitching the work, because in this case, the author already has representation. Is that it? Or?
No, so the author is unagented, never been represented before in the Western market. He's a very successful author in the Asian market, Giddens Co. He's like a bestseller. He sold 1 million copies. He doesn't need the Western market, essentially. Like, he's doing very well on his own. And Shanna is the one who is a massive fan of his work and said to me, oh, look, I really love this author's work. Like, it would be a massive dream of mine if I could translate his work and become, like, you know, his long-term translator. Is there something we can do here? Can we work with him? Can we pitch this? And so I reached out to the rights holder, and he was very happy for me to pitch on his behalf. And we went out with it here. I can't tell you who it's going with. It's still very early. I can't announce anything yet. It's confidential. But it's looking very good, essentially. But that's why I think, so that's the main thing, is that I think that the value of that translators bring to the table is heavily underestimated, because as agents, it is our job to discover new projects and to sell them. That's how we make our commission. That's how we get paid. But translators have been doing a version of this for years, identifying projects abroad that could work in English and then pitching them themselves, which is why a lot of international literature has gone to smaller indies, because they're more open to unagented submissions traditionally. And unless you're fluent in multiple languages and can read books cover to cover and can keep up with trends and focus on what's being published internationally, there's no way you can do this on your own. Like, you need a translator, you need to work with translators in order to be able to keep up if you're interested in building an international list in the long run. Sure, book fairs can help, but to maintain momentum, you need to stay plugged into those markets like year round and be able to know what's going on. And translators with linguistic expertise in specific areas can work with agents to identify these projects and creating opportunities for both parties, both agents and translators, when the underlying rights are available. And agents can't afford to lose translators, because translators are essential for growth. And if translators don't grow with us, then we also can't grow. And then on the financial aspect, more specifically, on the idea that translators, they don't make enough money. Like, why are we interested? It's not worth our time. There's kind of a misconception that all deals that agents do are all massive six-figure deals, but that's far from reality. Translators may not always earn what authors earn, but authors aren't necessarily always making agents big money either. In some cases, I've seen translators earn more than authors, because translators are paid per 1,000 words, but authors aren't. There's no like minimum rate. And so while you can negotiate it to a pretty high amount, there's also like no kind of floor. Like, I've seen some authors with no advance, but then they get royalties, 50% royalty straight away, for example. So it's not necessarily like that translators, like, they don't make enough money, the money's not big enough. What if we don't turn away authors because they don't make us six-figure deals, then why would we turn away translators? It doesn't really make sense. The whole financial thing is a kind of a myth that's been there, that translators don't earn enough. But yeah, I mean, it's not something that, yeah.
I think it's like an underdog syndrome.
Yeah,
We're just always feeling too small and not valuable enough to have, you know, someone representing our rights. We've only got 15 minutes left. I did have a question about conflict of interest, but I'm going to try to get to some of the audience questions first. While I quickly read them, I wanted to give you the opportunity, only if you want to ask each other a question. I don't know if there's anything that anyone has said in the last 40-ish minutes that have made you think, oh, I should text Marigold afterwards to ask for some more information. So while I quickly read the questions, please feel free to do that.
Safae, I'd be interested in whether you have certain projects. I began my publishing career as an agent, and I worked at David Hyam, and definitely some of the agents took the approach of being like, I'm going to take this small commercial project because that will pay the bills of the smaller, more interesting project doesn't take. And with you, obviously, Korean language books, some of them are selling incredibly well. And do you now, in-house at RCW, have you had to fight to represent African languages in particular? And does it help your case that you will be making good commission on some of your bigger Korean, or are RCW basically being really supportive? And maybe you can't answer that as well, because that is kind of getting into that's me being like a classic nosy publisher, being like, tell me about your agency. But I'm interested by what considerations you take into the kind of the smaller, weirder projects where you probably maybe know that it could win the Booker, or it could have 3 people who really love it, and that might be it.
It's a really good question, and I think I'm kind of in a lucky situation. So I'm associate to John Wood and Claire Wilson, which means that my salary isn't necessarily determined on like the commission I'm making or anything. And so they're kind of like to me, look, just do whatever you want, whatever you're interested in, pursue it, go for it. And I'm not under that kind of financial pressure to take on those like really massive projects, and for that to kind of pay for it, pay for the like smaller projects that I do in the African language projects that I'm after. I think it for me as well, because I also take on original English language work. So Anton, I took him on for his debut novel, Toward Eternity. I'm kind of lucky because I can be flexible and do various different things. I think for me, the languages that are more underserved, like the African languages, I'm finding it harder to break into because of the funding issue. It's because there's no like in a lot of languages, so I think Julia mentioned this, there's not like funding structure or anything like that where you can like apply for a grant and wait for that application process to be approved and for that to move forward. And it's very hard to move things forward if there's no like budget and there's no like pot where you're like, okay, this is where the money's going to come from for this, and we can like pursue more and more in that area. Whereas like Korean language is much better funded. And then you also have the issue of like there not being as many like book fairs. So I was in Seoul earlier this year for the Seoul International Book Fair. I got to see catalogs and look at different titles and share them with my translators and discuss those. I don't have a version of that for the African languages, and I sit down with my translators, Anum Zafar and Sawad Hussein, who both translate from Arabic into English, and I'm like, how do we find more? How do we sit down and know what's out there? Because I know there's loads out there and we're missing it, but I just don't know how to get to it, and I think that's my biggest struggle as an agent. But I'm not giving up at all. I think it's the struggle that everyone has at the beginning, and it's just about finding the right door to come in through. But yeah.
Thank you for that. Okay, so we have a lot of questions about Taiwanese funding. One question, and everyone was very anonymous in their questions. So what qualifies as a Taiwanese work for the GPT program? For example, if a book is published in Taiwan by a non-Taiwanese author, say from Hong Kong, would such a book be eligible for funding?
No, it has to be a Taiwanese national. Yeah, so non-nationals are not allowed to, the books by non-nationals are not allowed to apply.
Okay. Then we have a question about also Taiwanese funding. Is there a reason why the Taiwan Ministry of Culture doesn't have a scheme for translators to apply for potential funding to support excerpts they want to translate? Currently, Books from Taiwan supports the translation of excerpts, but these excerpts are all chosen by Books from Taiwan.
I think that's because we already have this scheme, Books from Taiwan. It is we made about like 200 expert books every year. So I think there's a allocation of resources. Yeah. So if you need expert of translations, yes, Books from Taiwan is where you can find. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. There's another question about the grant for publication of Taiwanese works which Jackie Long has answered. I'll just read it in case people haven't found their way to the Q&A section. But the question is, with the grant for publication of Taiwanese works, what does the translator need to have when applying? Do they need to have already secured a publisher willing to take on the project? And Jackie says, yes, this grant can only be submitted by a foreign publishing house, and she has also shared a grant. Is that, I assume that's correct, and we can move on. Since this is recorded.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah. Thank you, Jackie. And I think to close the Taiwanese questions, does the GPT also fund works that are written in Taiyu or indigenous languages?
The answer is yes.
That's excellent to know. Thank you for all the questions. Safa, do you choose translators you want to represent? And are you currently the only agent who represents translators?
Sorry, was that how do I choose the translators that I want to represent? A good question. A lot of them come to me via referral. So Anton will be like, you should talk to this person. Claire Richards will tell me this person is available, and Shanna Tan, etc. So they all the translator network is very tight and everybody seems to know everybody. And so that's kind of how I've been introduced to people. And I'll usually have a call with whoever reaches out and says they're interested, and I'll just find out what they're working on. I pick mainly based on like genre. So I like the horrors and thrillers and healing fiction, speculative fiction, romance, and various other like more kind of commercial genres. And so if somebody's working on something and I'm like, oh, this sounds really interesting, I want to hear more, and they have any kind of material, because it's the writing that I need to kind of get a sense out of. If they can send any kind of writing to me, and then we can go from there. Basically, that's how the conversations usually go.
Thank you. You have several questions, so I'm going to keep plowing through them. How much does it matter if the translator author is not based in the UK, but in Asia or Africa? Are publishers reluctant to sign up based on geography, as they wouldn't be able to do events, etc.? I feel like Marigold might also be able to answer some portion of that as like the publisher who may or may not be reluctant, but maybe you can start, Safa.
Yeah, I mean, majority of my clients are based abroad. Very few are based in London or even the UK. I think it's very normal for people to have a different postcode to live abroad, especially if they're working on international literature. Either they're the translator or they're the author themselves. That's very normal, and publishers, I'm sure, are expecting that as well. I've never seen someone be turned down because they're not based in the UK or the US. That would be very unheard of and unusual. So I don't think it matters. I think it's more about the writing and the quality.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I think we only have one translator based in the UK. And actually kind of going, one of the questions I've slightly answered is connected to this, in that quite a lot of the translators who have come to us have come because they maybe have some kind of a working relationship with the author themselves already. So we published a Spanish translator this year, a Spanish author this year, whose translator is American, and they've worked together before, and she trusted him, and we liked his sample. But I'm sure there'll be the Spanish language. You're not short of amazing Spanish translators, but it was both our liking the translation sample and also the fact that she trusts him. That was really important to us. And likewise, our Belgian author, we trusted her because it was Michelle Hutchison, but also he already knew her and loved her writing. So I think both really loving and championing a book is really important to me, by a translator, but also if they perhaps actually already have some kind of, if it's an author at the start of their career, if they're already working with them in some way, that is a good sign to me as well.
Thank you. We have a long question next. I think it might be our last one, and we'll have to say goodbye because we have 4 minutes. So Joanna Roque says, I have a double question, maybe a bit long for the discussion, but I'll just leave it here in case there is time. I was wondering about the role of crowdfunding as a way to overcome the financial difficulties that come with publishing. Parentheses, I know Tilted Access, for example, recently held a crowdfunding campaign, which is still live. And then more specifically, what do you all think about the marketing techniques for transnational literature and potentially migrant literature, which sometimes can exoticize or domesticate it for it to sell well in the Anglophone market? So that's a multi-layered question, and I will let whoever wants to answer it jump in.
I think the crowdfunding is a really interesting. I am definitely prone to, I will fling money at places like, I think Influx did one recently as well, and Tilted Access, and I'll support these houses because I think they're publishing really important literature and are doing really important work in championing languages and works that maybe aren't published by the bigger houses or read by a bigger audience, and they might be really long books and therefore really expensive to translate, and if they don't sell that much, then that could really create some problems. How sustainable it is in the long term to do crowdfunding, I don't know. I think it's a really tricky one. American presses have more kind of boards. Julia, you will know better than me, but I'm always fascinated by the American side of publishing. But on the marketing side of thing, the one thing I particularly, obviously there are the weird trends in covers where a lot of particularly kind of Korean or Japanese books, the women's faces were covered up or were holes or were kind of not absent. That was quite a weird, creepy trend. And that, thank God, I think most publishers have caught on that was a kind of slightly othering approach. And likewise, particularly books from Africa used to love a silhouette of a woman's head with lots of kind of foliage and lovely rich colors, which I get, silhouette and rich colors is a beautiful thing. But I think that's something that I'm always very careful. I love thinking of covers. And so I try very hard not to kind of go down the route of exoticizing or othering. But I think that at a publishing house as small as ours, where we have 3 full-time and one part-time person, it's hard to have like a really diverse staff. So the bigger the house, the more likely you are to have more diverse employees who will be able to say, this isn't necessarily the best way to represent my culture.
Safae, it looked like you were about to say something a couple of times, or maybe I'm
Oh,
just
no.
you were just nodding very
Yeah.
enthusiastically. I'll just end this by saying that Savat Hussein has an essay about covers in particular in, I believe it's in the Tilted Axis Press published collection, Violent Phenomena. And also, I just want to thank you all for your wonderful insight. I hope that the trend of representing translators continues, and that, Marigold, you continue to publish wonderful works, and that we get to work together again, because it was a highlight of my year. And Ulin, that Taiwanese literature continues to flourish. Thank you everyone so much for coming. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions, but I'm sure there will be other occasions. All right, I think that's it. That's all she wrote.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Julia.
Thank you.
Thanks so much all. Bye-bye.